I'm Elaine Quijano. Thank you for joining us for our special coverage of Day 2 of the 2020 Democratic National Convention. Night 2 of the convention wrapped up Tuesday evening. The roll call to formally nominate Joe Biden for president was unlike any other before, with delegates appearing virtually from their home states and territories. And as per tradition at these conventions, we saw Joe Biden's home state of Delaware put Biden over the top. Now, the night also included a lineup of speakers that addressed voters virtually. A number of younger figures in the party were featured, like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Stacey Abrams. She was part of a keynote address of so-called rising stars in the party. However, establishment figures joined in as well. Former Presidents Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter used their slots to tout Joe Biden's long record in Washington. One thing all speakers had in common were consistent attacks against President Trump. Here's some of what you may have missed.
America faces a triple threat: a public health catastrophe, an economic collapse, and a reckoning with racial justice and inequality. So our choice is clear: a steady, experienced public servant who can lead us out of this crisis just like he's done before, or a man who only knows how to deny and distract.
Millions are jobless. 170,000 Americans have died from COVID. And Donald Trump says it is what it is. Presidents should never say it is what it is. President Lincoln, honoring the great sacrifice at Gettysburg, didn't say it is what it is. President Roosevelt, seeing a third of the nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished, didn't say it is what it is. America, Donald Trump has quit on you.
At a time like this, the Oval Office should be a command center. Instead, it's a storm center. There's only chaos. Just one thing never changes: his determination to deny responsibility and shift the blame. The buck never stops there.
From the moment President Trump took office, he's used his position to benefit himself rather than our country. He's trampled the rule of law, trying to weaponize our Justice Department to attack his enemies and protect his friends. Constant attacks on the FBI, the free press, inspectors general, federal judges. They all have one purpose: to remove any check on his abuse of power. Put simply, he treats our country like it's his family business.
In this job interview, the difference is stark. You know what Donald Trump will do with 4 more years: blame, bully, and belittle. And you know what Joe Biden will do: build back better. It's Trump's us versus them America against Joe Biden's America, where we all live and work together. It's a clear choice. The future of our country is riding on it.
Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Major Garrett, and Antjuan Seawright. Ed is a CBS News political. I see Leslie Sanchez, but I don't see that in my script. So I'm not going to ignore you, Leslie Sanchez, and I'm going to say Leslie Sanchez as well. Work from home, hashtag work from home. All right, make your jokes now, everyone. Yes, I'm reading off a prompter. Okay, so here we go. So Ed is a CBS News political correspondent. Caitlin is our CBSN political reporter. Major is CBS News chief Washington correspondent. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst, and Antjuan is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Did I miss her name in the intro? We'll check that later. Ed, I know you have to go, so let me go ahead and start with you, because Day 2, going into this, I distinctly remember you saying that this perhaps generally in the past, what you see with these conventions, Day 2 is like season 2 of a show. What is your take, having actually now seen the second night of the Democratic Convention, on what it is, not just the roll call, but the actual messages being communicated on this night?
Sure. Obviously, Dr. Joe Biden, who just wrapped up a few moments ago, did a very effective job of reminding Americans, if they weren't as familiar with the story, about Joe Biden's heartbreak there back in 1972 when his wife and young daughter were killed in that car crash just before Christmas, and how she became part of a broken family, a heartbroken family, essentially. But also, I thought maybe even more effectively talked about her understanding and her experience as a parent and a teacher, and knowing the anxiety that a lot of families and a lot of people who do work in schools across the country are feeling right now as the school year begins, for the most part, virtually. But one thing that I know a few people have pointed out, and we'll probably talk about over the course of the rest of the night, is the fact that a lot of time again tonight was spent with Republicans. Colin Powell, who endorsed Barack Obama back in 2008 and 2012, that tribute from the McCain family, essentially highlighting the relationship that he had with the late senator and the 2008 Republican nominee. But for the second night in a row, in prime speaking spots, former Republican office holders or, Republican movers and shakers got more airtime than rising stars in the Democratic Party. And there have been some this week who have scratched their heads at this decision. The campaign defends it and says, look, the Biden coalition includes Democrats, independents, and yes, Republicans. For years, Biden had a reputation as being a bipartisan bridge builder, both on Capitol Hill and then as vice president, and they wanted to highlight and remind people about that. So we'll see if that helps sort of fill in the gaps for people and give them a sense of what a Biden presidency would be like. The other one, and God bless him for keeping it to just 5 minutes because he has a reputation and conventions are going long, from former President Bill Clinton, who tonight gave his 11th consecutive Democratic convention speech. All the way back to 1980 he goes, and has spoken every 4 years since. Tonight trying to lay out a very succinct economic argument on behalf of Biden, saying that the president has just simply not done it and that Biden can.
All right, Ed O'Keefe for us. Ed, I know you have to get going. Thank you. I want to turn now to Caitlin Huey-Burns, who is also in Delaware. And Caitlin, let me just ask you, jumping off of what Ed was just saying, first of all, what stood out to you? And also, what did you make of this time being given to these Republicans on this very night?
Well, Elaine, when we were previewing what we would see tonight, we were talking about the nostalgia that we've had for past conventions, and one of our favorite moments was kind of being on the floor as they announced the roll call. Well, scratch that. The tonight, what they did with the having people out in the country and filming from their respective homes was, I think, really compelling and different, and something that will be possibly talked about, and something that they could probably replicate from now on. It definitely had me questioning why I don't live in someplace like New Mexico. It looks really beautiful. So might work on that move if we're working from home from now on. Going back to your point and the great point that Ed made about the highlighting of Republicans, certainly an effort by the party to be a home for those who feel those Republicans who feel like they don't really have a home in the Republican Party of Donald Trump. But I just would love to have seen what people had thought 12 years ago. If you told people at the nominating convention for John McCain that he would be highlighted at the Democratic convention just 12 years later for a ticket that someone on that ticket he ran against in 2008. So it was certainly an effort to do that, but also noteworthy that some of the more progressive members of the party, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, were only given about a minute to speak, and so you did have some concerns and questions and some eye rolls from some Democrats about this time given to Republicans at a Democratic convention, when we've seen in primaries, congressional primaries, while Joe Biden ended up being the nominee because he is seen by Democrats as the most effective vehicle against Donald Trump, we've been seeing in some recent primaries during this pandemic a real reaction to kind of the status quo of the party and support for some of these more progressive, younger, more dynamic members coming up.
Major Garrett, I want to turn to you because the last time I talked to you, you noted going into the convention on day one that you were interested to see how technology would play into the presentation and the presentation of messages. What stood out to you? What's your take for the second night in particular of the convention?
So I've covered national conventions since 1992, and I will tell you that for me on the convention floor, the roll call of the states is tedious, long, drawn out, and hard to hear. I agree with Caitlin. I think from now on, it's going to look different, and it's going to look more like this in the future. Not just because we're doing it this time, but I think ongoing, with or without a pandemic, things like this are going to become more familiar because they're faster, they're more interesting, and they're visually welcoming. Also, to this whole point about Republicans prominent, progressives less prominent, conventions are balancing acts. Conventions are ways to put your best foot forward to where you're most looking for the marginally attached voters. They're not for your base, okay? So the Biden campaign knows that some progressives have their nose bent out of shape, that they're not getting prominent positions. Too bad. Do you want to win or not? Do you want to help me find those Republican votes in suburban parts of this country that are legitimately, by all polling data, Trump included, up for grabs? And does providing a little bit more time to Republican voices help us in that effort? The Biden campaign at the top levels has decided it does. And you know who gets to decide the schedule? The nominee. The balancing part came at the beginning of the night, and I thought the keynote address with all of these so-called rising stars, whether they're rising stars or not, they're people who ran under the Democratic banner in 2018 and won, diverse in so many different ways. And one thing we know for sure, forget all the polls right now, one thing happened in 2018 that will have an impact on 2020. Turnout was way up, the highest in a midterm election in a century. 23 states saw double-digit increases in voter turnout, and many Democrats benefited from that increased voter turnout, and we saw many of them tonight. So that's part of the balancing act. Yes, Republicans get a place, but these Democrats who were motivated to run in 2018, raised by higher Democratic turnout, are saying all of this is possible. This is a new reality, and we're helping create it. That's the balancing act that struck me tonight.
Antjuan, let me turn to you next. Major mentioned a moment ago this idea of pacing, that things seem to be faster with the roll call. I seem to notice that as well in the presentation about health care. You had story after story after story, images of people who have been profoundly affected for various reasons because of this issue of access to health care. What was your take as you watched that? Because, of course, as we have talked about many, many times on CBSN, 2018 showed that that was a winning issue for Democrats.
Well, I'll keep reminding people healthcare will be perhaps once again the most consequential issue of this election as it was in 2018. I said to you and others in the 2018 midterms, it was going to be the defining issue for a generation, and it was going to define who we are as Democrats and what our priorities are. Once again, because Donald Trump and the Republican Party have failed on the most important issue, according to voters, Democrats and Republicans from this coast to that coast, Democrats have a tremendous opportunity to remind the American people we are the party for health care. We are the party for making health care accessible and affordable. So throughout the night, particularly on the roll call, when you kept hearing the references to health care, what you heard was the references to Democrats hearing what the American people want. And you also saw a full display of our country's diversity, but our party's diversity and what we care about and what our priorities are. So tonight, I was a very proud Democrat because I felt like we are speaking to the hearts and minds of many people across this country, Democrats, Republicans, and independent thinkers alike.
Leslie Sanchez, let me ask you, as the Republican on the panel, what were your takeaways? If you were a strategist and this was the presentation given, and you had Republicans, as we saw, interestingly, on this issue of national security, which traditionally has been, as you and I have also talked about many times on CBSN, for Republicans a strong point, but making the case in this instance against the Republican candidate?
I think it's a really hard position to land, Elaine, for a lot of different reasons. These are individuals who have been outliers of the party. Some have been critical of the president. I'm going to tell you how Republicans are going to come back. They're going to say some of these have been naysayers to the president from the beginning. Some of these never wanted to see the president win, much less remain in office, and they feel that he has done a very poor service to this country in terms of his pandemic response. But the counter to that while you're talking about, and we heard tonight, healthcare and the message of healthcare, there was this pall of, I would call it a pall of Medicare for all, that was still looming in that crowd, looming in that idea, because you were balancing that with the name of Bernie Sanders during the roll call. You just kept hearing over and over again. So it's almost like, what were you hearing? What is your idea of the right healthcare balance? And that was counterintuitive, because for many people, when you ask about health care, they want to ensure pre-existing conditions, that they can protect against those. But what happened to keeping your own doctor? What happened to premiums staying low? This was not a slam dunk in terms of the health care that we have right now. And there are a lot of people, particularly small business owners, that don't want kind of version 2 of what a Joe Biden presidency would bring. So I think there's a lot of questions for those Republicans who are going to be on the fence, particularly on health care. And the last thing I would say is economy. We didn't hear about that today, but when the economy continues to tick up like we saw today, very strong numbers, that also makes it kind of a headwind for Democrats to say everything is collapsing when you see a very resilient American economy pushing back.
Caitlin, I want to ask you about the appearance by the candidate himself, as well as his wife making remarks. What kind of access, as someone who was assigned to cover this campaign, what kind of access have you actually had in this pandemic time that we're living in to Joe Biden himself? Has he done many interviews with reporters?
Not a lot, Elaine, and that's in contrast to what we saw covering these primaries, being out on the road with these candidates, including Joe Biden. These candidates were giving press conferences at least every day, sometimes multiple times a day at multiple stops. We've seen that really come to almost a halt during this pandemic, mostly because the campaign has not been a physical campaign. It's been mostly virtual, and Biden has done a few events outside in Philadelphia and around here in Wilmington, where I am, but taking questions only once a month. So there is pressure building on the campaign to be more accessible to the press, especially now that that he is the official nominee and that the ticket is fully formed. He is going to be doing an interview with another network this weekend, but he hasn't been out on the campaign trail because of the pandemic. And the campaign has been really trying to make a point to show a contrast with President Trump, who is going out there. Biden, I was just thinking about when I interviewed him in March, the last time that I was at a real campaign event. One of the questions we asked at that time was, what are you going to be doing differently in light of coronavirus? And it was still so new at that time. And he said he was going to be following CDC guidelines. And that's something that the campaign has been pushing forward, that they want to follow the science. They want to play this safe and not expose the candidate or potential voters to any sorts of vulnerabilities. But there is this question about the lack of questions that Joe Biden has been taking, and we hope that he will take more.
Major Garrett, let me ask you, as someone who has covered Joe Biden in his time in Congress and knows full well that sort of bipartisan spirit that Democrats tried to underscore. Sure. You also talk to Republicans now. How connected or disconnected is this sort of spirit of bipartisanship from the current political environment that exists in Washington?
More disconnected than the Biden campaign probably wants to acknowledge. The simple truth is, when Trump supporters hear that Joe Biden was a bipartisan senator and he got along with John McCain and he got along with other like-minded Republicans at times like John Kasich, they say, yeah, that's the problem. Trump supporters say to me over and over again, and I was just on the phone with two of them this week, reattaching myself to them after earlier conversations many months and sometimes a couple of years ago. They want the system still turned on its head. And the disruptive aspect of Donald Trump's demeanor, language, and methods reminds them of what they like most about him. Now, that's not all Americans, and it's not those who will probably decide the outcome of this election. The Biden campaign is much more at the margins. These Republicans who are still thinking through, even if they voted for Trump in 2016, are they going to do it a second time? Largely in suburbs, but not exclusively. Our polling indicates in some rural parts of certainly Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, there's a reassessment going on. And so part of the Biden message is to anticipate what's going to be said next week at the Republican convention by Trump and every other surrogate, that Joe Biden is a wild-eyed radical who wants to lead a socialist mob to destroy everything you believe and trust about the America you love. That's what's going to be said next week. The Biden campaign knows that. So this idea of bipartisanship, working through things, being a unifier, is, they hope, some measure of inoculation against that allegation that will be loud and clear next week. One other observation, Elaine. I was struck in Dr. Joe Biden's remarks and much of the biography component of this evening about how much of the Biden story is part of a grief story. Now, when I covered Joe Biden as a senator, that's not something he led with. It's not something he wore on his sleeve. And when you tried to engage with him, he oftentimes kind of brushed it aside. It was not a leading, defining part of who he was or how he saw himself. It is what he lived with. It's what he endured. It's what he built his life around. But he didn't knock you over with it at all. Quite the contrary. But tonight there was this very strong sense that he knows what suffering is. I would say ordinarily, based on my experience covering national conventions, that would be a bummer. That would be what we would call a downer. Why are you such a downer? Why all of this grief stuff? Well, at a time when the country is feeling anxiety, a sense of trauma, a sense of uncertainty, and a sense of suffering, this feels to me like something in a different way, in a different time, to communicate something that's also slightly different, about a resilience and a strength that I don't think you would emphasize in happier or more cheerful times. That may sound counterintuitive, but it's felt to me very much that the Biden campaign was trying to send a very strong signal about the understanding of hard times, personally endured, personally encountered, and personally overcame in the context of the pandemic.
No, a very profound observation as we all, as best we can, try and stay safe in the middle of this pandemic. I will just have to say, Caitlin was right. I am feeling very nostalgic. So for the record, I miss you all terribly. I just want to say that. I thank you all so very much. Caitlin, can you tell I don't get out much? All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Major Garrett, Leslie Sanchez, and Antjuan Seawright. So lovely to see you all. Thank you.
See you.